place to be is living free in Tennessee.
Welcome to Living Free in Tennessee, where we talk about building the life you choose on your terms. Today is Monday, June 30th, 2025, and it's the last day of June. This is episode 1057 of Living Free in Tennessee. And, well, about 1,049 episodes ago, I did a show all about a topic that comes up about this time of year: squash. Yep, that's right. We talked about I talked about 5 things to do with squash back then, 8 things to do with squash back then. And as a result of that show, um, a number of you have said that that's when you tuned in and started listening, and you've been here ever since. So that's kind of cool. I was like, wow, we got to celebrate the squash episode. And then it's also near and dear to my heart because one of my closest friends, you might know, in fact, he's here right now. Why are we friends?
Squash.
Yeah? That right there is why we're friends, right? It's the only reason. It's not quite the only reason. But we talked a lot about squash on Zello after that episode. And we talked a lot about food in addition to that. So it's kind of funny that I was out. So we went out to Trippy Acres Farm. I don't know if it's Trippy Acres, but I think it's Trippy Acres. Anyway, yeah. So we went out there on Friday, and she was like, "What do you do with squash?" And I was like, "Apparently, it's time to redo the episode after 9 years." And then I looked at the episode. I did the episode number. It was July 21st, 2016. I did that episode. That was episode 8. And then there was a lot of drama, and I almost didn't continue the podcast after that episode. So interesting, huh?
My brain is reminiscing.
Yes, you are reminiscing. So we're going to do that. We're also going to do our usual Monday segments. If you know anybody who needs to know about squash, let them know. And because I talk about sometimes it's a good idea to multitask, I'm also going to be snapping beans while we do this because because of being at Trippy Acres, I've got a lot of green beans to finish canning. So there will be some pressure canning happening at my house later. So before we jump into that, I want to talk about our featured event of today's show, and that's July 12th at Strong Roots Resources. There's a wild edible class. It's called Foraging on the Farm. July 12th, strongrootsresources.com. I have a link in the show notes that actually goes to the listing at Living in Tennessee on our community calendar, and it links also to the page on his site. But if you've been wondering what are the wild things around you that you can eat, that is a great class to take, and the price, you just can't beat it. So check it out, strongrootsresources.com. The wild, what's it called? Foraging on the Farm. Sorry, not the wild foods around you. That would be my overly dramatic take on the class. So that's the deal there. I also want to thank 2 sponsors today. Our first sponsor is agristaxadvice.com. Matthew Sursley from agristaxadvice.com has been active in our community. He comes to a lot of events, and if you see him at an event, you can bend his ear on tax questions. But what he does at agristaxadvice.com, well, he has a pretty cool newsletter where he talks about a write-off or a way of organizing yourself that you may not have thought of before if you have multiple revenue streams in particular. If you have like a business. And I find that really helpful because he also talks about like how to track it, what you can do, ways people have done it wrong, right? So that you know how to set yourself up for success on that and keep more of your money in your pocket. You can sign up for that newsletter at agristaxadvice.com/LFTN. But also you can sign up for a free consult with Matthew, and he will talk to you about if engaging him to actually analyze your books is a good idea, your finances. And then if you're a good fit for that, he'll go through everything and then talk to you about different structures you might want to consider and how to get set up to keep as much of your money in your pocket as you can by using the tax code in the way that rich people use the tax code, basically by taking advantage of the majority of the tax code, which is how not to pay taxes, not what we're paying taxes on, right? That's kind of the way our government and tax structure is organized. So check that out, agristaxadvice.com/LFTN if you want to sign up for that newsletter. I love getting that newsletter because they're easy reads. And, sometimes I'm like, I hadn't thought of that one. Maybe I need to build that into what I'm doing. So pretty cool. With that, it's time for our first segment, Monday segment of today's show, which is Tales from the Prepper Pantry. This is where we talk about storing what you use and using what you store. And my prepper pantry was in full disaster mode this morning after the event. So we had a really cool event this weekend, and it was a meetup where we did a potluck, and then we did a rabbit processing demo. And part of why we've been starting to do more meetups here is that we just want to connect with the community a little more often than we have been. We see people at Self-Reliance Festival, we see people at other events, people come to the spring workshop, but we haven't been doing lots of things here for a few years as I've been reorganizing how things are done here. We've been, kind of in a constant construction site, but most of that's behind us now. Not that it will never be back, but you know what I mean. And so we were able to do meetups again without having to worry about, is there a pile of drywall in the way? And we started doing them in earnest in this month. We did 2 this month. I think typically we'll do 1 a month would be my guess on that one. And the meetup, part of why I wanted to do that is I would like to add a rabbit processing class here long term, but I've never taught it before. And I haven't done a lot of rabbit processing, but the fellas have. So they taught the demo yesterday. And then Tim Riley heard about it, and he was like, hey, I've got rabbits that need to be processed. I'll bring them out. And he brought them out, and we had a great conversation with him. And originally I was going to sell rabbits to people who wanted to buy rabbits, but then because he donated those rabbits, we didn't process my rabbits, which are a little small for processing anyway. And he ended up, we just gave them to people who were there who wanted a rabbit to take it home to cook. And then I'll probably send an email later this week with some of my favorite rabbit recipes. But I'll tell you what, Amy Felak is probably the best person to talk to about how to cook rabbits. She's somebody, she just rattles off some really good recipes. Anyway, so that all happened. And as a result of getting set up for that, because we had a very hot week last week, we had some visitors last week. There was a little bit of a last minute whirlwind thing that happened. And then in the middle of the demo, Nighthawk's like, do you got extra knives and cut gloves? And I was like, yeah, I usually do. And I went to where they were and they weren't there. So I ripped it all apart looking for them. And at the end of the day yesterday, we were so tired, which is typical of that, right? But we were super tired. And I was like, tomorrow morning before the work day, even though it's Monday, which is the day I don't usually do this kind of thing, we are spending an hour, both of us, cleaning up the chaos that I created. And I know it's chaos of my making, but we did that this morning, and it's all put back together. The prepper pantry could use a good going through right now, just from a reorganization standpoint, now that I've pretty much gotten rid of the rest of any carbs we were storing that we're never going to eat. But it's the whirlwind's been handled. So that's good. But, sometimes that happens. And I think one of the demoralizing things about having a pantry can be when you have something come up that is like this event, and you undo all of your hard work. Then you look, because you just had to. And maybe it's that you had a medical emergency and you had to get into your medical supplies, and you learned that you needed to reorganize those differently than you were, because you have 4 open bins and gauze strewn from one end of your pantry to the other. I just dropped that bean on the floor. Anyway, it can feel demoralizing to look at it, but I can tell you, in an hour this morning, 2 people got all of the beverage service things cleaned. I got the dishes and like sterilized in our outdoor dishwasher. We got everything put away except for I still need to bring one delivery over to base camp basement of some of the, like my coffee urn and stuff that stores down there, not outside. And I got everything put back in the prepper pantry. So like from a time standpoint, that seemed like it was going to take me all day to recover from. And it took 1 hour while I was listening to a podcast, and no problem at all. So if you're feeling demoralized about your pantry right now, set an hour timer, listen to this podcast if you want something to listen to, and do what you can do in an hour and then stop. Because you don't have to do everything all the way through every single time. I mean, it's nice to finish things, but you guys get what I mean, right? So yeah, it was whirling dervish level dysfunction in the pantry, but I'm glad to kind of be back on there. And Trippy Acres was really fun to visit. They are having summer abundance and haven't opened their farm stand yet. So I put some vegetables out yesterday for donation. We didn't get any donations, but a couple people took some vegetables. And as a result of that, I am tapping into what we ended up having here and getting a jump on my green bean canning, because I'm probably pulling my first ripe green beans out of my garden this week. If not today, then this week, because I had little ones on a few days ago, which means they're probably big ones now. And we've had some rain, so they're probably big ones now. So my goal this year is to have 65 quarts of green beans put up. And because of this generous donation, I have, this is going to give me a big jump on it. Now I'm calling them green beans. This is dragon's tongue, which I'll find like it's a purple speckled green bean, and all of that color goes away when you cook them. Now, I swear that I used to cook these and they turned green, but when I cooked them the other day, they in fact turned white. But anyway, they taste like green beans. They cook like green beans. We're going to have probably green beans with dinner tonight, because that usually happens when I'm canning green beans. I'll just do a mess of buttery, delicious green beans. And we'll see how many jars I get out of this first run. And then I have another friend from the farmer's market who asked me if I need green beans this year, and in typical local cultural way was mentioning that there was part of his garden he just can't pick from. And I did not offer to go pick this weekend, but I may reach out to him now that we are through the weekend and don't have any other events scheduled here until the 26th of July. To see if he wants to do sort of a work trade thing where I go pick what he can't reach because of a back issue and they're down low. And, he take half, I take half, and then I can can them. So we'll see what he says about that. And then he can sell at the farmer's market. If I do that, I'll probably do it on Friday, which is Independence Day. But I have to see, because that would not work at all, because I know he has an event. Anyway, I'll talk to him and see if he wants to do that or what the deal is. I mean, I'm willing to pay for him too, but it just kind of sounded like he was hinting around, nobody at my house can do this, so can you do this? But he would never ask that thing, I don't think. So that's actually kind of the way people are sometimes. But we'll see how far along we get. And then the other thing we learned, so we've been doing these smaller events and not having a whole big staff here, because for the spring workshop, we have, a staff helping get meals ready, make sure everything's cleaned up and put away. But with, primarily Tactical and I on setup and tear down, and then Nighthawk coming to help when he's not at work, this, it's a little bit different scale, but it's also fewer people. We didn't have 50 people here yesterday, right? So what I discovered yesterday is that, we do the potluck, so we get fed, which is nice. And that means that I'm also not having to try to cook, a 3-course meal for people who are here, right? With the potluck, you just sort of get whatever you get. But it was a fun balance yesterday. And then everybody left, and it was like 5 o'clock, and we're tired. And about the last thing I wanted to do was cook a gourmet, evening meal. So we discovered it's time to pre-cook or pre-plan the dinners on those days too that we do events. And what I came up with yesterday on the fly, because I hadn't done that, was something that's very easy to cook from frozen is ground beef. And we had tacos the night before, so I had a little bit of leftover taco, but not enough for a full meal. And so I ended up browning up a couple pounds of taco meat and seasoning it for that, and then throwing the leftover taco meat in. And I had a bunch of leftover sauteed vegetables from the garden. I threw that in and then put it out with some cheese if you wanted cheese, and salsa if you wanted salsa. And we had makeshift taco bowls. It took me about 10 minutes to cook that. So not bad for a quick meal, having not planned a thing in advance. And that was a lesson learned. I have a little journal I'm keeping about these smaller events. It's like my Holler Hub event journal, so that as we're going, because you never do anything perfectly, right? So as we're going, we can sort of track what goes well and what doesn't go well. So that's what's going on in the pantry. Next up, I have a question from Brent, who asks, how do I get started with my freeze dryer? The background is he just bought a freeze dryer and is wondering if he needs to do a load of bread first or what. And so the answer is, in the manual to a freeze dryer, it tells you what to do to get started with that. And they do have you do a load of bread first. And here's part of why. If it's brand new, there may be still some factory smell that will come out when you're freeze drying. You might have to do more than one load of bread to get rid of that plasticky thing and change your oil. What I would do if I had a brand new freeze dryer is do the load of bread. It's testing if the freeze dryer is working properly, and you'd rather know that on a loaf of cheap bread than on the green beans that you so laboriously snapped and then prepared for freeze drying, right? So, because you have to blanch these. And if you discover, for whatever reason, there's maybe a leak somewhere in one of your hoses or something, or you didn't hook up something right, or you don't have the door closed enough, which is, like all of those things can be the thing, then you have just wasted all that food and all that time and all that work. So yes, do your batch of bread first. And after you've done, you'll go through a test first just to see if you achieve the proper vacuum. But things can go wrong, and then troubleshoot if things do go wrong, and until you know that you've successfully done a batch. And again, if I had a new freeze dryer, I'd do bread, and then I'd change the oil if I have an oil pump, because those weird factory smells will end up in the oil. And then if you do another batch, they're still there, right? Even though you don't technically have to change the oil, they're still there. And that's the fastest way to get rid of them. And that's oil I probably wouldn't even filter and reuse. I'd probably just toss it. So you can, because you can filter oil. Now, I have a webinar that I did on freeze drying that talks a lot about getting started and different tips and tricks I learned about freeze drying, that if you're a member, you can choose that as a webinar you want. Right now with the member portal, the way it is, I just talked to the person who's implementing the new system, because we have sort of a hybrid system going right now, but there's a new system that's been being built for a while. And I'm the problem, by the way. He was waiting for me to get him some verbiage, and it took me 6 weeks to get him verbiage. So I am the delay. Anyway, he has that. I talked to him, and it looks like in the next week or two, he's going to be able to get that in there. But if you want that webinar and you're a member, reach out to me, because I can connect you with it manually. And it's one from years ago now, so it's pre-recorded. Now, the other thing I would say if you're starting with freeze drying is there's a group called Betty's Harvest Right Freeze Dryer on Facebook. They have a MeWe group too, but the Facebook group is more active. Plus, I'm shut out of MeWe, so I don't even know. And that, you can pretty much search that group and be like, strawberries. And then somebody will come up who had problems with strawberries. Somebody will come up complaining about their freeze dryer. And somebody will come up with, this is how you do strawberries. These are the settings you set up for your freeze dryer. And you can just follow that. They even have documentation that you can look at, so that, they don't have to keep telling people over and over. But what happens is people ask anyway. So they end up telling people over and over how to do different things. and you'll see successes and failures there. That's the best getting started with freeze drying group I've seen. And then there's a YouTube channel called Retired at 40 that's also a great resource for freeze drying. So that's all of my thoughts, Brent, to get you started with freeze drying. My freeze dryer has been broken again. I'm the problem. I need to do a last troubleshoot before we get the replacement part that broke, and I haven't done it. And Tactical and I were just looking at the freeze dryer. In fact, I have easy access to it because half my stuff is out of my mudroom right now, so I can clean the floor underneath everything. And he was like, yeah, we got to get that up and running again, because like these green beans that I'm working on right now that aren't green, these purple beans, I could have also blanched some and freeze dried them, and that would have been pretty darn cool too. So what I've learned over the years of having a freeze dryer is I freeze dried like snack cheese and cold cuts and stuff like that. I don't eat them, so I don't need to have them. But like my base ingredients like green beans or milk or eggs or stuff like that, I've used as I go. And then when I make soup, stews, chilies, that sort of thing, bone broth, freeze drying that stuff has been really useful to me from a staying nutritionally balanced when I'm on the road standpoint, as well as hiking food. It's way better than anything you can buy at the store, as long as what you cook to begin with tastes good. If what you cook to begin with does not taste good, freeze drying does not make it taste better. So yeah. Margot says, put the freeze dried stuff you're not going to eat in the farm store. Great idea. That's right. Everybody's all excited about the farm store. I kind of did a little one yesterday at the event too, but it was up here where people were. And most people were mostly interested in my coffee. So that was interesting. But we'll see. I've got a lot of people interested in starting to maybe put stuff in there. And then also that membership, like pre-order and pick up model, it seems to be resonating with some folks. It just depends on, do people want to drive all the way to the hauler if they don't live near the hauler to get the stuff, right? So anyway, but that is a great idea. Hey, Alabama says, how do you like the flavor of your freeze-dried foods? I do like it. There is like a little bit of, I can tell it's freeze-dried, but compared to commercial freeze-dried stuff, I like it better. I think partially because I'm getting my recipes and I like my recipes. My recipes, which by the way are not actual recipes, it's just like I balance spices based on what I have. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. Like I can give you measurements of the spices I put in, but the difference between something I've grown in my garden versus something that comes in a jar from the grocery store is usually the one from the grocery store is weaker. And so part of cooking is follow the recipe, taste it, and decide if you think it's the right balance. And if it's not, adjust, right? Especially like a saute or something. So I'm sure I'll integrate that into my homegrown cooking videos at some point. Like this is how I manage spices, because at different times of year, even the spices I'm using are going to be different, right? Like fresh spices have a different impact. You can toast those before you use them, and it brings out the flavor, which is pretty cool. I learned that trick from Chef Ken Daniels. It's Eat, Live, Learn something is his website. And then he's doing a whole new project on how to with ketogenic cooking, because he's been controlling his diabetes that way, which is pretty cool. People ask me for recipes, but I do not measure, so it's hard. A sprinkle of this and a handful of that till it tastes good. Yeah, that's a lot of it. So part of it is when you learn techniques instead of templates in cooking, the techniques endure. And then you can kind of make it up. Like I had a soup that was not the best soup I ever made, but it was a good soup I made yesterday, just from, chicken and tomato and some other stuff I put together. That's right, Michelle, you weren't here, so I put tomato in it. And she'll know who she is. Yes, Michelle, I am talking to you directly. But it's, you just sort of learn to balance it out. You learn you want a certain amount of sweet and savory and bitter, and like there are certain flavors that go with certain other things, strong flavors versus subtle flavors. Sometimes you want to, like I was doing a lot of curries with chicken for a while there because chicken tasted kind of like rotten fish to me. after I was sick with COVID, and that's actually finally gone away. So yeah, that's just something that when you have the technique, you can account for stuff. Anyway, next segment is Operation Independence. And this is where we talk about building local ongoing revenue into our lives, or avoiding the need to pay a guy. We kind of did a little bit of both of those things with the meetup this weekend. So the rabbit processing class, I would say, was a success. And somebody from our community, Valerie, showed up with some rabbit gambrels and then showed people how to make them. So I thought that was a pretty cool add-on. And we processed rabbits. We got a crash course in a little bit of rabbits and food. I even sold coffee. So I think it was a win-win. And I think we're going to, as I said, we're going to keep doing the meetups, but it also is a way to connect people with each other. So, we had people from as far as 3 hours, well, further than 3 hours away. We had one visitor in from another state who I will see again tomorrow. And then as we had somebody who's just recently moved very close to me, like she's probably within 8 miles of me. And that's good because she's out there by herself wondering who else is doing this stuff. And the answer is, in this area, lots of people. So let's connect, right? So that was kind of cool. But the big news is the HVAC was installed on the roasting shack. And so the HVAC pre-buy is no longer happening. I do need to pull the product off my website. But thankfully, when I go out there to roast either later today or tomorrow, it's not going to be 4 million degrees because somebody put it in, and the somebody who put it in did it as a favor, which means I didn't have to pre-sell as much. And I have a favor I can do for that person later this year. So that's the power of community right there, right? Is when you can do things like that are not necessarily overtly a trade, but it really helps to get that done because I avoided the need to pay a guy, and I also didn't need to learn how to install my own mini split. So that was kind of cool. Anyway, those are all the usual Monday segments for today's show. Next, we're going to talk about our main topic, which is multiple ways to deal with an abundance of squash. Now, why in the world would I be doing this today, do you think? Well, you may have noticed it was hot last week. And last week in Tennessee, anyway, I don't know how it is where you are, squash really started popping. And by squash, I mean the yellow summer squash and the zucchinis, which it's kind of a bittersweet thing that happens here. So it's like the shrimp scene in Forrest Gump, because it all came in. We get squash vine borers here, which decimate our plants. And on a large scale growing squash, when you have a whole field of it, they'll get like 10%, no big deal. But when you have 2 squash plants, which is probably more squash plant than you really need to feed a family of 8, because squash is so prolific, you end up with lots of squash all at once. But if you only have 2 plants and the squash vine borers come, then it's just done. And then if you put more plants in at this time of year, what happens is they don't do well. A little later in the season, going into the fall, you can try again. It's like literally starting this weekend, time to start your fall plants, your broccolis and your whatever that you're going to transplant in September. And you can transplant squash and cucumbers, but you probably don't, unless you have a really good shade structure for them, you don't want them outside in the sun of August here. It's as baby plants, right? And this is when we're giving that calcium boost as well. So most people get the squash rush and they start throwing them in people's cars or giving them away, or they make squash or zucchini bread. But really, there's so much more you can do with squash. And the one thing that's not great with squash is canning it. It's just, you'll end up with squash mush, and that's not super helpful. So this episode, we're just going to talk through different ways to use it fresh, some freezer meals you can set up to be ready for Christmas, for winter, and having, a little bit of this garden abundance if you have enough freezer space for it in the winter. And then also we'll talk about a few oddball things that are delicious that you can do with squash. So the first thing is, the best way to use any garden abundance is fresh. Like, you can put it up, but fresh is best. Like, you pick it today and you cook it today or tomorrow. And at that point, the vitamin content in your whatever that you've picked is as high as it's ever going to be. And it is losing vitamin and nutritional density as time goes between it and you putting it in your mouth, right? So if you do what I do and start cooking at 5 o'clock, by which you mean spending from 5 to 6 in the garden and then cooking at 6 and eating at 6:30, if you have a half hour sort of meal plan or however that timeline works, you can do a really delicious saute. Like, the thing I do with squash the most, I don't bread it and fry it or do anything complex. I take the squash, I dice up some onions, I dice up the squash. If there are peppers in the garden, I dice up the peppers. And then I make a stir fry or a saute, if you like, same basic, we call it all the same thing here, and serve it. And I'll often add to that garlic, different spices. If we have a lot of oregano or thyme or sage, I'll just put those all in there too. A little bit of dill goes a long way. Cumin adds a different twist to it. You can put soy sauce or fake soy sauce in there. Just any way you'd spice it. What I will say about spices is, recipes are like a teaspoon of this spice or that spice. No, it's actually like, that's fine. You'll taste the vegetables more. It's okay to put a lot of spices in a stir fry. Like, if a teaspoon, you're like, it's missing something. Next time you do the stir fry, try a tablespoon of that spice and see if that makes a difference, right? So I often will pre-mix my spices, maybe put a little smoked paprika in there or something, and I will end up with a good 1/4 cup total of different spices I'm putting in there, sometimes more. And when I realized that, I was like, oh, like, people are so careful or worried about over spicing things, and you can, but also know you can dial that up or back based on what your goal is. Do you want to taste more of the squash, or do you want the squash to be a little bit more oregano-y, so to speak? Then another way that's really good, and I'll take the squash and cut it the long way into about 1/2 inch thick slices, and I will put it on the grill or on the Blackstone, but usually on the grill, and just let it rip while I'm making, something else to go with it. It pairs great in the morning with eggs. So if you're like, I got lots of squash and we need breakfast and I'm cooking eggs, you can make your eggs over easy or scrambled or whatever you do. And then the squash, you put a little bit of spice on there, a little salt, a little pepper, something, garlic, something, and just grill it. If you have a smoky grill, you're going to get a smoky flavor, right? So that's another thing that pairs well. And, 1 squash, 2 people is probably even more squash than you want. You can also put that on a charcuterie platter for lunch, right? So there's lots of ways that will serve you and lots of flavors you can dial in. You can grate it as if you're having a cabbage salad, or if you live in a part of the country where lettuce still happens at this time of year, a lettuce salad, and you can put a little bit of grated fresh squash on there for a different flavor profile. You can soak it in a little bit of vinegar first and salt, or lemon juice and salt, and it will be like pickled, like quick pickle squash that's going on as a flavor boost on your salad. Of course, just the standard breakfast scramble does well with chunks of squash and pepper in it. And then the other one people don't think of, that especially if, like me, you're trying to keep your carb count down, even though squash has carbs, like, know that. Like, you can't just eat a big pile of it. Zoodles. I can make zoodles from a yellow squash, or I can make zoodles from a zucchini squash. But that's what, in fact, that's a great thing to do when you have a giant squash. Like, oops, I forgot to harvest it. The one that hid from you, you know what I'm talking about. A lot of people throw those away or compost them. They're good for a couple of things. One of them is zoodles. And then if you're like, I've got oodles of zoodles. I've got oodles of zoodles. Then you can freeze those. Now, I freeze dried my zoodles once. And what I discovered about shelf-stable zoodles is storage is an issue. So if you freeze dry your zoodles and you squish them, they will turn to powder. And so then you end up with squash flour, which is something you can use in place of flour. But then you might as well not go to the pain in the butt of spiralizing them. You might as well just slice them up and turn them into squash flour. You know, like freeze dry it in slices and then grind those up in your blender and you've got squash flour. It will thicken soups. Again, you're adding carbs when you do that, just so you know. But a lot of people are trying to find ways to not use wheat flour in things. That's one way. That's another way of thickening soup or gravy or whatever. So yeah. So those are really good. You know, if you toss them in the skillet with some spaghetti sauce or with some, I use, you know, leftover bacon grease. I'll saute them up that way to kind of keep them from sticking together. Then you can use them like pasta without having the wheat of pasta. So I love it this time of year. I'll tell farmers at the farmers market, like, if you know that one zucchini you can't sell because it's no count because it's too big. They're like, yeah. I'm like, I want that one. And they just give them to me. So that's a way to use up those. Okay. Main dishes you can do with squash. And something that is another trick on not using wheat is a squash lasagna. So you make it just like lasagna, and in place of the noodles, you have slices of squash. Now, the challenge with this is if you just straight up slice up the squash and throw them in the lasagna, you kind of have more like a lasagna slop versus a lasagna. But if you slice them and put them on like a cookie drying rack, salted, that'll start leaching out the moisture, and that can help, and dry them real good with a towel or paper towels or something. That can keep you from having the soupy experience. I mean, the lasagna is still good when it's soupy. I've done it, but it is better when you get the zoodles a little bit, or not the zoodles, the squash slices a little bit dried out. And again, you can go long way on the squash if you want it to be more like for real lasagna, or you can just do rounds. If you do rounds, you can just toss it in a bowl with some salt and, you know, let it drain out and dry them. So that's a really good main dish. And the preserving part. So the other thing is, if you can't eat all the squash and you want to preserve it, one way to preserve it is to pre-make that lasagna and throw it in its wonderful little pan into the freezer. And then you have a ready bake lasagna, squash lasagna for some other time. And that's a trick I like to use, is doing one, you know, two or more of the same thing, because I'm in the mode, and putting some in the freezer so that I have convenience food that's homemade and don't have to have store-bought convenience food as much, which A, costs more money and is not as good for me as if we're just eating homemade food as much as possible. So that's like a time-saving trick in the kitchen as well. So squash lasagna freezes well, in my opinion. The next thing is ratatouille. Have you seen the movie? Yeah, ratatouille is like tomatoes and squash and all sorts of goodness cooked up in a pan. And it's more of a soupy sort of feel. And there's official recipes that you can use, or you can just make it up. But I use it as a side dish. Other people do it as a main dish. We're always going to add more meat to that, but as part of the thing here. But ratatouille, squash. There's squash in ratatouille, and also I had to relearn how to spell ratatouille today, just as an aside. I was like, how do I spell that again? Right. That's not one I do a lot, but I'm probably doing it this week because I have all the pieces that I want for that dish right now. And that's really just that's a cell. If you think about what that dish is, it's a celebration of harvest of this time of year when all of this stuff is coming fresh from the garden. And it's, I have a tendency to eat a lot more vegetables in the summer versus the winter because everything coming off the garden is a vegetable. And it just seems like, seasonally speaking, it's time to eat all this stuff, right? So then another one you can do with your oversized squash is a squash boat. And that's just basically, think stuffed bell pepper with ground beef or whatever in a squash. You can do an Italian seasoning. You can do more of a, Chinese or Thai seasoning. That's how you dial the dish in. You can go dill and garlic, and that's more of a German seasoning. You can do herbe de Provence and do that. But you saute it up, spice that. You saute up the beef, spice it well, and then you prepare your overly sized squash by scooping out a cup in the middle. And then, like this variety of squash, it's like a zucchini flavor in a round squash. You can cut it and you scoop out the seeds, and then you saute that up like squash. Or you could make that would make a really good stuffed squash sort of thing. If you're a carb eater, you can mix it with rice and other goodies in there. And then you bake it, maybe add cheese to the top or something. I would salt that before I stuff it to leach some of the moisture out again, because extra moisture, again, you end up with soupy soup, McSoup face. Then you just bake that 350 degrees, whatever, in your oven till the squash is soft. That's probably going to take anywhere from, depends on your oven, depends on what you're cooking it in, but anywhere from 25 minutes to 45 minutes, unless you're doing a lot of them, then it'll take longer. Because that's the other thing, is when you do a vent scale on this stuff, it takes longer to bake in the oven because there's so much volume in there. You put it in there and the temperature just falls, right? So that's another one. So ratatouille, don't freeze that. That's not going to freeze and reconstitute super well. But do that with squash boats. Packrat says, Mom used to do that with the regular old ashtray tasting eggplants. I think I'd much rather have that done with a squash boat. Yeah. So I really like eggplant, but you can do some wrong things with eggplant. And then the variety of eggplant matters. And eggplant's another one where salting it and letting it leach out some of the moisture can really make or break a dish, so to speak. So then let's talk about preserving squash, right? The first way I ever started preserving squash for winter, I took squash and I had way too much squash for my garden, and then I sliced it up and I was like, I need to freeze this. You don't need to blanch the squash, by the way. So I was like, what do I do? Well, what I thought to myself was, you don't want the squash to all be one big squash ball in your freezer. So you need a way for it not to stick to each other, and it's naturally wet because you just sliced it up. And so I threw flour in the Ziploc bag and shook it so it kind of coated the squash, kept them from sticking to each other as much. And then whenever I wanted to do a winter saute, I would open one of those bags and throw it in, and it was delicious, right? Ooh, I literally just shot one of the green bean seeds out, and it hit my computer and then put a little skin on there. That was kind of funny. But so that's the way I did it. And that's like flour dusted sort of thing. Well, okay, now I don't really eat wheat anymore. Like I occasionally have some, but basically I stay away from it. And I'm using chicken flour for things. So I'm probably, depending on if the squash flush like keeps happening, plus I have the flush from Trippy Acres, I'm probably going to shake it up in chicken flour and see how that does, right? I wonder if you could use squash flour on squash. It's another experiment to do. And this is the thing. You've got all the squash it's an abundance. You can experiment with it, and if you don't like it, you can compost it later. So just know that is another thing about this is I'm telling you what I've done. I'm telling you what's worked and what hasn't worked for me. But along the way, we'll have other ideas, and we might as well do what we can do to have food variety throughout the year as best we can with the tools that we have. Okay, here's one I don't have a recipe for. Dawn Gorham made it, and I want to get her recipe, and I keep forgetting to ask her for it. But, you guys can bug her about it on social media, so maybe we'll get it into the collective knowledge. But it's pickled squash relish. I make a badass cucumber pickle relish that everybody loves. You can like straight up make deviled eggs out of it. You can put it on stuff. People love my relish. And she left me a jar for some reason of pickled squash relish, and it was delicious. And I'm pretty sure it was her. Hopefully I'm remembering this right. But that is a great condiment to just go on the side of anything. It does well on a charcuterie platter. If you're the hot dog and relish type, that's a funny place or way to use it. Like I just eat it. I'll just put it on the side of my charcuterie platter and realize I'm not eating crackers or anything. And I'll like roll it up in a piece of meat or something. So good. So good. So that's one that is a more like it preserves, right? It's in the jar. That's how you preserve squash is you're not having to pressure can it because of the vinegar, right? And so you don't have to have it as hot or as long. So then it's not as decimated, structurally speaking. But then also it's a little squishy, but it's a relish. So it's okay. So that's fine too. The other thing is just pickled squash. So I make dill pickles, quick pickles, as well as fermented. I make those and I use that brine to pickle squash. And I choose squash that are structurally robust or the little baby ones, like whole little baby squash. Put them in a jar, pickle them. Again, it's another really cool addition to your charcuterie platter, which I really like. So, so that's some other, ways of preserving it. Of course, something I should have mentioned earlier that just occurred to me is zucchini bread, sweetbreads. You can do zucchini bread with zucchini. You can do zucchini bread with squash or with yellow squash. So you don't have to have the specific squash necessarily. Those are delicious. You can freeze those. You can pre-make them and freeze them if you're a wheat eater. There are recipes to do gluten-free, wheat-free. So that's another way you can do it. And in that case, I would probably, if I was going to just freeze, what I would do is freeze how much squash I need to do it for a future one, grated, in the amount per one recipe. And then I would make it fresh because I prefer, like you can freeze those, but I prefer baked goods if I'm going to have a baked good to be as fresh as possible and not from the freezer. Not that, if I was starving, I wouldn't eat it from the freezer, but A, you're taking up less freezer space that way. And B, it's more delicious. And we live this lifestyle because we want delicious food, right? So some weird ways you could do it. You can make squash chips with your freeze dryer. And I haven't tried it with an Excalibur dehydrator, but I bet if you dehydrate like salted and garlic sort of slices that you would get something interesting from that as well. So that's something maybe I should try this summer since my Excalibur is not currently in use and I have squash around and just see what that makes as a snack food. And then once it's shelf stable dry, it lasts a long time. Another thing you can do is toss squash in soups. If you're going to do this, though, make the soup. And then towards the end, like it'll probably take 5-10 minutes to soften up in your soup without turning into it's gone in your soup. And you put squash there, but it's just in the broth now, right? So if you make a soup that you're simmering on the stove for 45 minutes or an hour and 45 minutes or however you're doing that, put it in at the end. Likewise, if you're doing an all-day crock pot, then, maybe the last hour or two, I don't know how long it is, you would put the squash in because structurally, it's not like carrots that you have to like put them in at the beginning or you're never going to have the carrots softened in your soup. Like the squash is almost already soft enough before it was even cooked. It's just when you cook it, it changes the mouthfeel and the flavor a little bit. So yeah, that's the other thing. So those are all of my ideas. It's like this is a redo of episode 8. The thing about this is when you live on a homestead, you end up having successful years for some things and unsuccessful years for others, or less successful, right? This year's been a cucumber year early on in Tennessee. And so you want to tap into that abundance now while you have it, because next year might just be a crummy cucumber year for whatever reason. We have these seasons when things grow better and things grow worse. And when you talk about eating seasonally as much as possible, that means when you have all the squash in the world, you're building squash into every meal that you can, because it's what you have in abundance right now. And there are people whose theories are like, hey, eating seasonally is better for you nutritionally. Like cucumbers really can boost, they're linked to helping you retain hydration. So think about that. We had an abundance of cucumbers, and the week after that, we had an abundance of heat. Well, that's interesting timing now, isn't it? It's almost like nature has a plan. So, I think finding ways to keep as much of your abundance as possible, or make it into things you can share with others, of course, share with others, is a great way to move forward, and then to also tap into those flavors at the time of year when we don't have as much coming off our homestead. And something like summer squash, which seems so transitory, especially here where the squash vine borers get them, you can be like, man, it's my favorite time of year. I get this squash, and then it's gone. And the only way you're getting it is by buying from the commercial food system. But that's been on the road we don't know how long, right? Or you can tap into your abundance when you have it, eat as much fresh as you can stand until you're sick of it, and then preserve it up, pickle it, pre-make some lasagnas, pre-make some squash boats for that time in November where you're getting ready for Thanksgiving dinner and you're going to have your awesome harvest meal. And you're a little frazzled because you had to cook 4 pies and your kitchen just got clean again. And oh no, we need dinner tonight. And you know what won't have a lot of leftovers? Squash boats. Everybody's getting a squash boat, or we're splitting squash boats, and it's done. And that's like future you is happy that current you tapped into the abundance that was there and thought about ways to work it back in. So hopefully this gets you guys thinking about different ways to use an abundance of squash, so that maybe you don't have to throw as many zucchini into somebody's car next time you're at Walmart. That's the joke, right? Anyway, if you like the show and want to support the work I'm doing here, you can do it in 2 ways. 1, get your coffee at hollowroast.com. 2, consider becoming a member. Head over to livingfreeintennessee.com to find out more. With that, guys, go out, make it a great week.